This is the 11th Sunday after Pentecost, and our first Old Testament lesson for this morning is the story of Elijah, a man who went from tremendously high highs to tremendously low lows. After his triumphant victory on Mount Carmel against the priests of Baal, he winds up running for his life, believing that he's all alone. Nobody cares. There's no support. He even questions whether God cares for him or not. Well, he does. And Elijah finds out about it. In the first book of Kings, chapter 19, beginning at verse 9. At that place, Elijah came to a cave and spent the night there. Then the word of the Lord came to him, saying, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He answered, "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they're seeking my life to take it away." He said, "Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Now there was a great wind, so strong that it was splitting mountains and breaking rocks in pieces before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of sheer silence. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. Then there came a voice to him that said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He answered, "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they're seeking my life to take it away." Then the Lord said to him, "Go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus. When you arrive, you shall anoint Hazael as king over Aram, and you shall anoint Jehu, son of Nimshi, as king over Israel. You shall anoint Elisha, son of Shaphat of Abel-Meholah, as prophet in your place. Whoever escapes the sword of Hazael, Jehu shall kill. And whoever escapes the sword of Jehu, Elisha shall kill. Yet I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. We have a second Old Testament lesson. Let's consider its context. Now, I grew up in a family with 3 siblings. I was the number 1 son because I was the firstborn. My brother, who came 3 years later, is the typical middle child. He was the nurturer. He was the caretaker for our mother when she grew old. But Deborah Ann, with tiara firmly in place and royal scepter in her hand, Deb, you were the princess. And my brother and I chafed under that sometimes. Joseph is the 11th of 12 sons, with Jacob as their father. However, they did not all have the same mother. If we read back in the Bible, Joseph's father, Jacob, was the son of Isaac and the grandson of Abraham. And if we remember, Jacob wasn't the nicest of guys. He cheated his brother Esau out of his birthright and blessing and wound up on the run. He wound up at the home of his uncle Laban and fell in love with Laban's daughter Rachel. And so he said to Laban, I will work for you for 7 years if you will give me Rachel to be my wife. Well, he worked for 7 years. They had a wedding. They went into the wedding tent. They consummated the marriage. We know what that means. And then when Rachel takes off her veil, it's not Rachel. It's her older sister, Leah. Well, Jacob's a little nonplussed by that. And, hey, you tricked me. And Laban said, hey, got to marry off the oldest daughter first. Tell you what, you work for me another 7 years, and I'll give you Rachel too. And then you can have sex with her. So he wound up marrying both of them. Leah was able to produce a number of sons. Rachel was barren. And typical for that culture in that time, Jacob was given permission to go and sleep with Zilpah, who was Leah's maid, and Bilhah, who was Rachel's maid. And they both got pregnant. And together, the 3 women produced 10 children. And it was at that time that the love of his life, Rachel, gave birth to a son, Joseph, and then another son, Benjamin. Well, Joseph was the apple of his father's eye. He was the favorite. He was the prince in that family. And we know the story about how his father gave him a very fancy coat to wear. And Joseph had dreams of being in charge and people bowing down to him. But like a student, he shared those dreams with his brother. Someday, you're all going to bow down to me. Okay, let's kill him. And so when Joseph went out to check on how they were tending their sheep in the area known as Dothan, they decided, okay, here comes the prince. Let's kill him. Well, one of the brothers said, we shouldn't do that. It's not right to shed our brother's blood. Let's just throw him in a pit and leave him there.
So much better.
So they did. A deep pit with no water. But then along came a passing caravan, and one of the other brothers said, hey, let's sell him. So they did. And Joseph was sold to a Midianite caravan for 20 pieces of silver. That caravan made its way to Egypt. If you remember the story, it started off kind of rough for Joseph, but he wound up with a senior administrative position, second only to the Pharaoh. And in a time of famine, Joseph was the one responsible for distributing the grain that they had been saving during their 7 years of bounty. Well, there's a famine in Israel too. So Jacob sends the brothers down to Egypt to beg for grain. Joseph recognizes them. They don't recognize him. And so they wind up bowing to him just as it had been in Joseph's dreams. From the book of beginnings, the Genesis, chapter 37, beginning at verse 1. Jacob settled in the land where his father had lived as an alien, the land of Canaan. This is the story of the family of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was shepherding the flock with his brothers. He was a helper to the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought a bad report of them to their father. So Joseph was a snitch. Now, Israel, another name for Jacob, loved Joseph more than any other of his children, because he was the son of his old age. And the Lord had made him, and he had made him, a long robe with sleeves. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. Now his brothers went to pasture their father's flock near Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, "Are not your brothers pasturing the flock at Shechem? Come, I will send you to them." He answered, "Here I am." So he said to him, "Go now, and see if it is well with your brothers and with the flock, and bring word back to me." So he went from him from the valley of Hebron, and he came to Shechem. And a man found him wandering in the fields, and the man asked him, "What are you seeking?" "I'm seeking my brothers," he said. "They have gone away, but I heard them say, 'Let us go to Dothan.'" So Joseph went after his brothers, and he found them at Dothan. They saw him from a distance, and before he came near to them, they conspired to kill him. They said to one another, "Here comes the dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we shall say that a wild animal has devoured him, and we will see what becomes of his dreams." But when Reuben heard it, he delivered him out of their hands, saying, "Let us not take his life." Reuben said to them, "Shed no blood. Throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, but lay no hand on him, that he might rescue him out of their hand and restore him to his father." So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the long robe with sleeves that he wore, and they took him and threw him into a pit. The pit was empty, there was no water in it. Then they sat down to eat, and looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead, with their camels carrying gum, balm, and resin, on their way to carry it down to Egypt. Then Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come on, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him, for he is our brother, our own flesh." And his brothers agreed. When some Midianite traders passed by, they drew Joseph up, lifting him out of the pit, and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver. And they took Joseph to Egypt. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Paul was raised as a Jew. He was a scholar, and he was an expert in Jewish law. But as a Christian, he came to realize that his relationship with God was not based on how well he kept the law, but rather on God's grace through Jesus. And so Paul is an apostle sent to share the good news. And when the Jews reject him, he turns to the non-Jews, the Gentiles, and becomes the primary missionary to them. From Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 10, verses 5 through 15. St. Paul writes, "Moses writes concerning the righteousness that comes from the law, that the person who does these things will live by them. But the righteousness that comes from faith says, 'Do not say in your heart, who will ascend into heaven?' That is to bring Christ down. Or who will descend into the abyss? That is to bring Christ up from the dead. But what does it say? The word is near you, on your lips and in your heart. That is the word of faith that we proclaim. Because if you confess with your lips that Jesus is Lord, and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For one believes with the heart, and so is justified. And one confesses with the mouth, and so is saved. The scripture says, no one who believes in him will be put to shame. For there is no distinction between Jew and Greek. The same Lord is Lord of all, and is generous to all who call on him. For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. But how are they to call on one whom they have not believed? And how are they to believe in one in whom they have never heard? And how are they to hear without someone to proclaim him? And how are they to proclaim him unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. From what I understand, the Sea of Galilee is a large lake, and it's a body of water where if the wind comes down out of the north, people on the lake can be subject to very violent storms. Jesus got done preaching to the people, and he told his disciples, you go ahead on the boat, cross the lake to the other side, I'm going to have some me time. And he went up into the hills to pray. Well, they're rowing across the water, it's the middle of the night, and sure enough, big storm. And the wind and the waves are battering the boat, and they're afraid they're going to die. And they're rowing as hard as they can to get to the opposite shore, and it's slow going. And then just before dawn, they see an apparition coming across the lake, walking on the water. Jesus speaks to them. Peter demands proof of this person's identity with rather disastrous results. This is the Gospel according to Matthew, the 14th chapter, beginning at the 22nd verse.
Glory to you,
Thank you, O Lord. Immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But by this time the boat, battered by the waves, was far from the land, for the wind was against them. And early in the morning he came walking toward them on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, "It's a ghost!" And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat and started walking on the water and came toward Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened and began to sink, and he cried out, "Lord, save me!" Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind ceased. And those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.